Good evening. I'm Joe D'Annunzio, and I am the Executive Director of the Mike and Renee Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship here at UC Davis. We are so thrilled this evening to have you join us, and we have an extraordinarily special guest with us. We're grateful to have Jonathan Reckford. He is, for the past 15 years, the Chief Executive Officer of Habitat for Humanity International, a global nonprofit organization that helps families build and improve places to call home. And he is a great embodiment of the kinds of change makers that we all aspire to be and want to have as part of our conversation here on campus. Habitat, as you may know, is one of the most impactful nonprofits in the world, with local organizations in all 50 states and more than 70 countries. Over the past year alone, Habitat has helped more than 6 million people build strength, stability, and self-reliance through shelter. A little bit of background on Jonathan. He graduated from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill as an undergrad, and then earned his MBA from my alma mater, Stanford University Graduate School of Business. And before taking on his leadership role at Habitat, Jonathan held a number of management positions at companies as varied as Goldman Sachs, Marriott, Best Buy, and the Walt Disney Company, where he and I worked together and met. Jonathan has many roles beyond his CEOship at Habitat. A couple that are important to note. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Urban Steering Committee for the World Economic Forum. He's the author of a recent book, Our Better Angels, 7 Simple Virtuals That Will Change Your Life and the World. He and his wife, Ashley, have 3 children and live in Atlanta, which I understand it has turned winter-like, not so much quite yet here in Northern California. So I know it's virtual, but please join me in giving Jonathan a warm Aggie welcome. We're so looking forward to your talk.
Great. Joe, thank you so much. It is wonderful to see you again. And thanks to all of you for tuning in to one more virtual meeting. As much as I miss visiting areas all around the world where Habitat is at work, I'm grateful for the technology that allows us to have gatherings like this one. In a typical year, journalists and others are busy in November and December preparing a year in review package to look back at the highlights of the last 12 months. Tougher this year. Obviously, we are far from typical. We've had a year of a deadly pandemic, a year of financial crisis for far too many people in the world, and a year of racial reckoning in this country. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to think with me for just a moment about how intricately connected housing is to each of those situations and to most every aspect of our society. If you care about health, you have to care about housing. If you're passionate about education, you have to acknowledge the link between a stable home and better education outcomes. If you care about racial equity, you have to examine housing policies as we seek to correct systems of racial injustice. We're still finding our way out of a remarkably polarized political year. People are always going to have different opinions about leadership. In some contrast to our current state, when I joined Habitat 15 years ago, both former President Jimmy Carter and the late Congressman and HUD Secretary Jack Kemp were on our board of directors. They would have never agreed on economic policy, but they were both deeply values-driven leaders who cared deeply about our work and were motivated by their faith. It's okay if we don't agree on how to get things done, but at Habitat, we believe that everyone can agree on the fact that no one should be living in desperate poverty. Bringing people together has been not our core mission, but a deep strength of Habitat for more than 4 decades. I have had the privilege of building with Blacks and whites in South Africa, Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, Hindus and Muslims in India, Muslims and Christians in Egypt, young and old, even Democrats and Republicans. Habitat was founded by a committed group of people seeking to live out their Christian faith in a very tangible way. And that's what attracted me and still inspires me. Many of the world's other great religions also include an imperative to help and serve others. And Habitat enables followers of those faiths a concrete way to serve their neighbors as well. Your motivation to make the world better may come from a different place. Whatever that is, I applaud your fervor. Our world needs passionate, positive, and compassionate people to tackle the many societal challenges that we face, including housing. For me personally, the idea of caring for others in this world was an oft-repeated message I heard as far back as I could remember. One of the most influential people in my life was my grandmother, Millicent Fenwick. She was a New Jersey congresswoman who was committed to issues of social justice. She was not your stereotypical grandmother in the 60s and was never timid about speaking her mind. She was the model for Gary Trudeau's Doonesbury character, Lacey Davenport. If you're not familiar, it's worth Googling. She also, early in her career, wrote the Vogue Book of Etiquette, a bestseller in 1947. So in order to graduate to the grown-up table at her house, one had to be able to sit up straight, hold one's fork properly, and discuss food problems in sub-Saharan Africa, which I found both fascinating and terrifying as a 10-year-old. Grandma had a very imposing presence. What I remember most is pretty much every time I saw her, she would challenge my brothers and sisters and me to be useful. She would also recite to me what she called her life verse from the Bible, Micah 6:8. He has showed you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God? That passage of scripture and my grandmother's unconventional determination to fight for social justice were profound influences on my life. She didn't much care about what positions we might one day hold. Rather, her most important directive for us was simply to find a way to be useful. I like that word, useful, because it's not just about doing something good or about filling your time productively. It's about work that connects you to others. It's about finding your place as a part of something bigger than yourself. I'll admit, it took me a long time to find my path to usefulness. After college, I had planned to get a law degree and go into politics, but I realized I had no interest in practicing law, so I had to come up with another plan. Despite being a political science major, I talked my way into a job as a financial analyst at Goldman Sachs. I spent very long hours every day working on huge deals. And when I headed home to my apartment in Times Square, I passed by so many people experiencing homelessness, people for whom a single dollar was the difference between eating and going hungry. I didn't feel useful. So after a couple of years, I quit. I spent a life-changing year in Korea working with the Olympics and reflecting on faith and the direction my life was heading. When I returned, I followed Joe to Stanford because it was one of the only business schools at that time that believed in the need for professional management of nonprofits. After graduating, I spent the next decade and a half at a variety of corporate executive jobs with increasing responsibility. I had some wins and some pretty spectacular failures, but learned something at each one of those stops, and even learned a lot from the time I wasn't working. My career did not unfold in any way the way I'd anticipated or expected. When I've experienced disappointments or become restless or anxious because life was not happening on my timetable or schedule, eventually I've been able to look back and learn something valuable from each of those situations. I couldn't possibly have orchestrated the unexpected path that led me to Habitat, but from the side and in the rearview mirror, I can see how they all fit together and prepared me for my current role. One of those long stretches of white space came from after my last business role, my company was acquired, and I had a rare chance to walk away, and with an unusual non-compete clause that really stopped me from working for a period of time. And it was an incredible blessing to spend more time at home with my young family, but it was also a challenge as a type A competitive person suddenly to be a stay-at-home dad and really just trying to discern what my next step was. And I found that it wasn't that easy to let go of an identity that was maybe overly tied up with my occupation. It was as an act of discipline, when people asked what I did, I would just kind of bite my tongue and say, I'm just taking care of my kids and thinking about what's next. And it was tempting to talk about, but I used to be X, Y, or Z. And I look back, and that was such a great time for my family, but it was also such an important time for my own personal development and preparation, even though there were some moments along the way where I wondered if I'd made the right decisions. In an effort to learn more about myself and the world, I had the chance to travel. In India, I was working alongside the Dalits, people commonly and pejoratively called untouchables. Among the Dalits, the Bungi are the poorest, most marginalized group in the country. At that time, the only jobs they were allowed to hold in rural areas were to hand clean latrines and to clean up dead animals. They weren't allowed to live in the community, and half the children were dying before their 13th birthday. Seeing children living in those conditions just devastated me. I was convicted by the poverty I saw, both abroad and at home, and what an extraordinary difference relatively small interventions could make. I felt what the spiritual father of Habitat, Clarence Jordan, called divine irritation, when injustice can no longer be ignored and you're driven to act. I spent more time volunteering, continuing a long trajectory of coaching pastors and helping churches grow. And that led unexpectedly to an invitation to take a full-time leadership role at my church. Everyone I trusted for career advice thought this would be career suicide. However, as my wife Ashley and I prayed about it, taking this position seemed to be what I was supposed to do. It turns out that I loved working for the church, and it was exactly what I needed to be ready when Habitat unexpectedly came calling a couple of years later. If I could have designed my perfect job, it would have been something like Habitat, a global Christian mission empowering families and communities. So when a recruiter called asking for recommendation for someone who could lead Habitat, shiver ran down my spine. I just didn't anticipate they would consider me. I share that because I want to encourage each of you watching tonight to contemplate your calling. That's not the same as just trying to follow your passion or your career guidance or career preparation. I'm asking you to think about how you'll find your purpose, how you will discover, as the theologian Frederick Buechner describes it, where the deep gladness of your heart and the world's great need meet. Where the deep gladness of your heart and the world's great need meet. For me, that was using my business skills to lead an organization to enable me to serve those most in need in our world. And for the past 15 years, I can honestly say there's nothing I'd rather do, despite the very difficult challenges that have shown up along the way. When I first started, had my 100-day plan, and I was going to go around the world and visit programs all over and just learn. And then about a week and a half before I was supposed to officially start, Hurricane Katrina hit the United States, one of the biggest domestic housing disasters in recent history. And we were already trying to respond to the Indian Ocean tsunami in Banda Aceh and all across the Indian Ocean basin. Suddenly, there was no business as usual. The destruction demanded that we think not just in terms of building houses, but of impacting entire regions. We drastically changed our ideas of what was possible and found bold new ways to scale up our work. That was the beginning of a seemingly endless stream of disasters, both natural and man-made, that our world has faced. One that continues to haunt me more recently was Hurricane Harvey. Some of you may remember the 2017 storm that pounded the Houston area. 5 trillion gallons of water dropped on Houston, and the flooding affected 13 million people, damaged or destroyed more than 200,000 homes. I visited the area shortly after and met Vicky and her 9-year-old daughter, Aaliyah. They just wanted to put their lives back together. The first thing that struck me as I was ripping out drywall and trim in Aaliyah's room was the jumble of ruined possessions strewn on the floor. Stuffed animals, playing cards, math workbooks, and a basketball. Vicky wanted us to save her dishes and whatever shoes we could, which we carefully did, along with a few family photos. I realized that this family and so many others will be starting over. I told her that Habitat would be there and that we would walk beside her and other families for as long as it takes. And unfortunately, with these big disasters, the recovery can take years. For all the trauma they inflict, catastrophes also have the power to strip our pretenses away. They remind us of what truly matters. They often reveal our true foundations, our character, and they forge connection and community. Shortly after the rain stopped in Houston, President Carter authored an op-ed for us comparing the disaster response to the world he once knew, a world where you counted on your neighbors and they counted on you. In it, he wrote, "When the water rises, so do our better angels." He's right. From stories of uncommon kindness and heroism after 9/11, to the more than 500,000 volunteers who came to the Gulf Coast after Katrina, to individuals who are taking care of their neighbors isolated by the coronavirus, catastrophes inspire our better angels to rise. In his article, President Carter also wrote, "The way we respond to a disaster should be a template for the way we respond to each other every day." It really could be that simple and that profound. In helping families improve their living situations and build a better life, I know I get the chance to be useful. I feel it every day. Our mission statement sums it up well. Seeking to put God's love into action, Habitat for Humanity brings people together to build homes, communities, and hope. I want to share just one example of some unlikely people who came together through Habitat's work. In Egypt, we had partnered in one small village with the imam, the local Muslim worship leader, to build his home. After his house was complete, we were to begin work on the home of a Christian family in his community. But construction could not start until their previous home was demolished. That meant the family would have been homeless for 3 months. Despite initial feelings of discomfort, he told me he took the family in and shared his home with them. His Christian neighbor had been such a positive force in the community that he wanted to respond in kind. The love he was shown by Habitat was so profound, he wanted to offer it to others. I now realize that my grandmother wanted me to be useful because she knew that my life would be better, brighter, and more full of hope if I had genuine compassion for others. I pray that we will begin to change the rhetoric, that we will find healing for our country that is so passionately divided. Whether it's in the books or articles I read, compelling speeches or conversations in which I engage daily, the same theme keeps emerging. We can do better than this. We must call upon our better angels every day. So I want to echo my grandmother today and ask, how will you be useful? What is your calling? Our individual efforts will make a difference. Our collective efforts can change the world. So thank you, and I look forward to the conversation now.
Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was wonderful to hear. The journey you've been on is truly amazing. And so we're grateful to hear about it. And we're also eager to start a conversation with you. So for those of us in our audience, I have a few questions that I'd like to start off with Jonathan that I think will be of general interest. But please use the Q&A function to share your questions for Jonathan Reckford. And we will curate those and do our best to get to as many of them as we can. So again, use Q&A to type in your questions, and we will get to them in just a little bit. But I want to start off, Jonathan, with, as you pointed out, rarely is anybody's journey a straight line. Even if you have a vision of what your life's going to be, it never seems like that's, God's plan. I think one of the things our students, grapple with, whether they're undergrads or PhD students or postdocs, is, the decisions that they have to make about, do I go here or there? Do I go into industry or policy or into a nonprofit? How do I make those decisions? I think it'd be, it'd be helpful for you to talk a little bit about, maybe one or two of those times where you did have that, kind of big, we talk about a little bit of sliding door moments where the decision you make are going to have a pretty profound impact on kind of your arc. If you could share a little bit about how you went through that process of making a decision, I think it'd be very helpful for, for our students to hear that.
Thank you, Joe. And it's funny, I'm not sure I'm a very good role model in some of this because it's so interesting in life that in many cases, it was really a sense of opportunities arising and then praying about it and feeling, that sort of gut sense that this is the right thing to do. So I didn't intentionally plan many. When I think about the inflection points, that year in Korea was really meaningful because it took me out of everything that was familiar and forced me to, I was the only, spent a year living in the Korean training camp with a Russian boxing coach and all the Korean coaches and athletes for a year, completely removed. This was pre-internet, pre-email, so separated from everything that was familiar. And that gave me enough distance to have some time to really reflect, but also learn about the world in a new way. I would say, and I actually think it was a great decision. When I left business school, which was the first time I kind of really broadly thought about jobs again, my primary criterion for decision making was to get to Washington, D.C., where my now wife and then girlfriend was living. So it is, and then she said it was a bait and switch because I lost that job a year and a half later, though we did get married. And then I got recruited to Disney, where eventually I ran into Joe. So, and then, things would come along that looked interesting and seemed to work from a family perspective. And each one, and the hardest one, honestly, for us was we were very happily living in Richmond, Virginia, and I got a great retail job to move to Minneapolis, Minnesota. And you all live in California, but Minnesota has real winter. Atlanta, we dabble, once or twice a year with a freeze. And my wife quite seriously believed that this might kill her, and being a good Southern woman, and that God would never want her to go to a place that cold. But it turned out to be an amazing place to live. Our kids loved it. And in fact, that was an important grounding time for our family as well as from a career perspective. And so it is, I think what I would say is you have to, in a perfect world, get a good sense of both what you're most interested in and what you're good at. So that idea of motivated ability. So can you figure out the intersections of a cause that matters, but also a role that fits with your giftedness and your skill sets, as well as your energy. So, I think the danger of the follow your passion is if I were to just follow that instructions, I would have tried to be a professional basketball player. And there was just one small problem with that being my jumping, shooting, and height, but otherwise it was a great plan.
Well, and it's funny because you and I both spent some time early in our careers, kind of growing up in the Disney environment, and there's challenges and benefits of every corporate organization. But one of the things I took away from that experience was this notion you just touched on of casting, right? Of finding the right role for the right person. But sometimes that's really hard to do. And you talked about that moment where you get out of your comfort zone. How do you kind of screw up the courage to do that, to get out of the comfort zone?
It's a great question, Joe. And I think everyone has to decide their own sort of risk profile and change profile. I found I actually love change. I got bored really easily. And so I never intended, my dad was a teacher and taught in one place for 3 years and then one university for 44 years. And I thought that's what you did. You sort of found your place and locked in. I never kept a job for more than 2 years, and I don't think I ever stayed with a company for more than 4 till Habitat. And now I'm sort of setting a record every day. But it is, so I didn't, I found what other people perceived as risky to me was intellectually interesting. And I was really interested in learning. And I actually think that's a value that's important as you think, particularly as you're starting your career. I think your learning curve in many ways is more important than specifically what you do in the near term. And I had the counterintuitive advice, and Joe may have crossed paths with him as well. John Gardner, the amazing leader, retired to Stanford when we were there. And I had the gift of a leadership seminar. And, as this super career stressed 25-year-old, to have him say, it doesn't actually matter what you do in your 20s. Just think of your 20s as continuing education and soak up as much as you possibly can. And you'll eventually figure out what you're supposed to do. And that was surprising, but really helpful in terms of thinking. And I was blessed with some really great mentors who tended to focus very heavily on skills and growth and learning rather than just sort of brands and and resume, I would say.
Mhm. Well, that's great, and thank you for sharing that, Jonathan. I think you've hit on two things we try to teach in our curriculum. The first, the importance of mentors, of a network to help you early in your career, late in your career, and all along. To be a sounding board, to be someone that provides expertise and insights. I know one of us, we live in a community. And the second one, we like to talk a lot about Professor Carol Dweck at Stanford and this growth mindset, and particularly early in your career, this notion of, it's about the process of learning and having that intellectual curiosity and willingness to explore. And so, in your career was certainly, demonstrated both of those things. All right, I want to shift to, we've talked about this before earlier in our lives, the importance of, of kindness. It's certainly been something that's been, my family taught me from very early on. And in your book, Our Better Angels, you walk through the importance of 7 virtues, one of which is kindness. And I want to read something that you wrote. When we step outside of our own selves and are kind to people who don't look like us, or have the same religion, politics, socioeconomic status, or experiences we have, it breaks down the barriers between us and them. In fact, most of the time when you're being kind, you're not thinking about any of those things anyway. That stuff doesn't matter. You're simply a person being kind to another person. I found that, not surprisingly, very, very, very compelling. Can you talk a little bit in your experience about the role that kindness plays in the positive changes that Habitat and other organizations are trying to make in the world?
I so appreciate you asking, because often in business conversations that sounds soft. It's, oh, social, we should be kind. That sounds, that's not real tough stuff. Yet, if you sort of took the reverse as a most basic idea, who wants to be treated unkindly? How many of us want to be on the receiving end of being treated poorly? And it goes to the most basics sort of element of human dignity, that every child in this world has worth and bears the image of God, and so deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. And I think it's that basic human connection. And I think one of the most awful aspects of the coronavirus, though we've still seen remarkable aspects of service and kindness, break out, is the shutting off of people from one another, and the physical distancing, and finding ways to overcome that. Because it is, I think about all the places I worked, and they're different cultures. Actually, Joe and I laugh because Disney had the most amazing culture in some ways. Customer service was spectacular. This not just, you wanted to exceed expectations, you wanted to create magical experiences, but there were elements of the movie side of the business that were harsh. And I remember thinking about if I was going to have a career, and an unnamed leader who had a famous quote saying, well, other companies do good cop, bad cop. We'll do bad cop, antichrist. And I'm like, ooh, and that's funny on the one hand, but a little terrifying on the other. And and my hope, at least, in my career, which I certainly didn't do perfectly, was to attempt to live, a sort of countercultural way in business, and see if that could still work. And I still believe it's incredibly powerful. And I think we've seen a shift. It'd be interesting to see how history looks back from the sort of celebrity CEO model of a very autocratic kind of top-down CEO, to much more the sort of Jim Collins level 5 leader, that combination of deep passion for the mission combined with personal humility. And I think all these virtues tend to build on one another. But to me, kindness is almost the building block, and maybe it lays on top of humility, which is that starting point, which is, it's really not about me. And I've always been attracted to those leaders who, were all about the mission versus all about their own ego or power.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Jonathan. And I just want to follow up a little bit on that. One of the stories in the book about kindness is a woman named Dorothy Howard and her family right around the holidays, where they're moving into their new home, and it's a huge moment, and things don't always go the way you expect them, and there are a set of challenges, and and how the volunteers at Habitat, went above and beyond even your expectations for what would happen in that kind of situation, that sort of connectedness that you're talking about. Um, what is it going to take, candidly, in your view, for that kind of spirit to maybe, be a little bit negative here, reflourish? It feels like we've lost some of that. And maybe it's perception, maybe not, but certainly I feel it. What's it going to take? Because you read that story and you go, yes, that's human kindness. That's who we are, as, that's why we're here. And yet it seems to be more the exception than the rule.
I think it's going to take, as it always had, it has to happen at the, at the grassroots level. I don't think this comes from national policy. I don't think it comes from, though there are things I would certainly advocate for. I have long advocated for a year of national service for all young people, because I do think, not military, because we don't need that big an army, but if everybody did a year of service, I think increasingly the largest divide in our society is less religious, ethnic, even political or racial, it's socioeconomic, that so many people now don't have meaningful interactions with people outside their socioeconomic class. And that's bad for everyone, in my view. And in a way, Habitat's mission is about housing, but the software of bringing volunteers together isn't because it's a great construction strategy. It's actually very intentionally a view that it's a human change strategy. And this amazing pastor, Clarence Jordan, who I quoted earlier, he had this prophetic letter. And he started an interracial farm in 1942 in South Georgia. And if you can imagine how far ahead of its time that was. And then in the 60s, the farm was being boycotted and harassed and bombed. And they were really struggling. And he took a group aside to really think about the future. And he took another incredible prophetic step and came with this idea of a fund for humanity. But he had a quote in this letter that was so powerful, and that turned into Habitat for Humanity. And he said, which was ahead of its time as well, what the poor need is not charity, but capital, not caseworkers, but co-workers. And what the rich need is a wise, just, and honorable way of divesting themselves of their overabundance. And he had a view that everyone had something to give and everyone had something to gain when they worked together, so that there was a real sense of mutuality or of dignity in that process. And I think that's where it has to be recaptured, is that neighbor helping neighbor, but neighbor writ large, and where we can sort of get back to the basics. And the not so secret beautiful part of that is it gives you a feeling of community that is so missing. So I have so often have people come and thank me for the chance to go out and get really hot, really uncomfortable working, because they're connecting to something that matters. And I think so many people are hungry for that.
Yeah, there's no question. And I love that notion of mutuality and dignity. That's very powerful. Remind everyone, in a few moments, we're going to shift to questions from our audience. And I know we've already got several, but please, there's still time for you to submit those. And we'll get to them in just a moment. A couple other questions for you from me, Jonathan, before we move to the audience. So the vision, the mission, the manifesto that Habitat has is amazing, but the impact you have is driven by people. Right? It's driven by the people on the ground locally around the world. Can you talk a little bit about just sort of the nuts and bolts of the capabilities, the funding, the organization that goes into managing a global entity that has the kind of impact and reach that Habitat has? Because again, it's great to have the vision and the mission, but at the end of the day, the impact you have is, through the people that actually accomplish it.
Thanks, Joe. And I think often start with this, but often everybody knows Habitat in the US typically because we're a very well known brand, but most people, we laugh, we're most famous for things that aren't true. So the thing that everybody knows about Habitat is President Carter started and runs it. It's not true, but he put it on the map, and there's no question he's our most famous volunteer and an amazing hero of mine. The second is the perception is we give away the houses. And I actually think that's an important misconception, because one of the things that makes that mutuality so powerful is the families that buy Habitat houses actually work really hard. So they put in sweat equity. They actually help build their house and their neighbors' houses. They take classes in financial management and home maintenance, and then they pay back an affordable mortgage. And those payments recycle in their community that then help the next family have their opportunity to be able to purchase a home. And so I think that creates some of that sense of true partnership that's been really important. Just some quick numbers. It is big and complex now. Last year, total system revenue was about $2.3 billion. As Joe talked about, we helped about 6 million people worldwide in 70 countries. In many places, it doesn't look as much like the US model where volunteers are coming out and building alongside the families. Often it's families in the community helping one another build, because you don't have a huge volunteer base in a Cambodia or Malawi or Bangladesh, but there's still a huge need. And I would say one thing that really drove or accelerated our growth dramatically was changing our strategic question, our framing question, from how many houses can we build, which was a good question, to what would it take to meaningfully reduce the housing deficit in every geography that we served. And that led us or forced us into thinking more systematically about change. And so this started 14 years ago, but first, that meant we really focused on advocacy and property rights, because in so many places in the world, women may have lived and other marginalized groups may have lived on land for years, if not decades, but not have the legal right to stay there. And if you don't have the right to stay, then it doesn't make sense to invest in upgrading your housing or to take out a loan. So we had to start at the foundational level with property rights. We then had to solve financing, because in most of the world, low-income families can't access a traditional bank loan. There's no banking for them. So we have been pushing to get the microfinance industry to do home improvement lending. We've become a global leader in housing microfinance that included launching our own wholesale housing microfinance fund to lend capital and train microfinance banks to begin housing portfolios. And now we've launched our Terwilliger Center for Innovation in Shelter, where we're running shelter tech venture labs and investing alongside private sector entrepreneurs who are coming up with better building products for very low income families. So our goal is to make the market actually work for low income families so they can improve their own shelter. And that has started to scale at level stratospherically more than we could do if we tried to build all the houses. Now we're still building, because we still think that volunteer and that direct community engagement part is a critical piece of our credibility and our knowledge so that we can stay relevant. But we see if we could really change the way markets function, and now the U.S. market is broken, and California is exhibit A in that, where we're 3 million units short in California already, and it's growing in terms of housing that's affordable for low and moderate income families. So we have got to figure out how to make the market work better so we can supply more housing. Sorry, I could go into a whole different speech on that.
No, but I think that's extraordinarily important, because I think that too often we see organizations trying to kind of control a process or do things the way they've always done them. And what I hear you saying is we have a set of skills and insights, and if we want to scale the impact that we have to apply those in fundamentally different ways as the organization evolves. So one brief follow-up on that. So as you think about your career and the things you've learned, what skills, experiences, relationships have really prepared you to take on what is a extraordinarily complex role, both the public-facing role that you have, but also the organizational you'll have internally to Habitat?
No, I think I was blessed to get to work around a lot of really smart people, which was such a gift. I often think about business careers, especially as you start as a generalist, and then you've got to find, I often talk about sort of the elevator shaft. You've got to find a vertical to kind of show you can do something. And for me, that was strategy, much like Joe, so I leaned towards strategic planning because I found growing things really interesting. I was just interested in how companies and organizations could grow. And so mostly it was involved with starting up or helping grow fledgling businesses within big companies. And that turned out to be really helpful, and in a way soaked up bits and pieces along the way. Marriott was great at how do you deliver consistent service in all kinds of contexts around the world in different ways. Disney, amazing on customer service, and also just the creativity and just sort of design principles. There was actually turned out to be a real estate component in most of my jobs, which I never expected. I went to Circuit City Stores, which I was not planning at all, because they were starting CarMax. And I just thought that was so fascinating because it was going to disintermediate the way cars were sold, and actually had a big impact, though Circuit City then crashed and burned, which is a sadder story. And then went to, this will shoot all my credibility down, because I then went to help lead a now dead retailer called Musicland back. Some of you may actually remember that long ago, people went to the mall and bought music on plastic discs, but it's in a far off part of history. But back then it was the largest retailer of music and movies, specialty retailer, music and movies in the country. And they were seeing the digital revolution. So we were coming in to try to reposition the company and figure out how to survive. And then unexpectedly, Best Buy bought the company, which made sense for the shareholders, though it turned out not to be a great acquisition, sadly, for the company. And that business was going to change. But I would say, when I look back, even that, running 1,400 stores turned out to be incredibly valuable when we've got 1,200 US affiliates and 70 country programs, because you learn about distributed management, and that's very different than local management. And so I think, and that gave me my first shot at really running operations, which I had wanted to do, having been in staff roles most of the time, to actually have a chance to be running a business. And so each of those pieces, and most, as I talked about, most counterintuitively, working at the church didn't fit the story at all. But actually, if you think about a church, it's the ultimate volunteer experience, right? The staff can't do the work. A faith organization only is successful if the volunteers actually own it. And so in some ways, I learned a lot about how do you motivate and serve in an organization that is primarily led and driven by volunteers, not staff. And that was incredibly useful as you think about it. And it drove one of my management philosophies, which is we should treat our staff more like volunteers and our volunteers more like staff. And so many organizations kind of mess that up and waste their volunteers' skills and time and effort, or don't love on their staff enough.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Jonathan, for sharing that. And we're going to move to, I still have several questions, but I feel like I am monopolizing you. So we're going to shift to questions from our audience for a bit. And so I think there's one that builds really well on what you just mentioned, which is, so you think about, the experiences over the last 15 years. What have you learned from, the countries outside the U.S., other cultures, and maybe it's prior to your time at Habitat, but what have you learned from all other cultures that has, helped shape what you've done at Habitat?
It's such an important question, and I think the starting point is to start with an attitude that I'm going as a learner. I'm not going to bring the answers. I'm going to learn from local leadership. And most of the big ideas don't come from the center. They come up from the field, and it's going to figure out who's doing something new and really interesting, and then which of those ideas are actually syndicatable, which ones could be replicated in a large way, and which ones are unique because you've got a really charismatic local leader that can pull something off that no one else could pull off. So it starts with, I think, a posture of humility in terms of respecting the local leadership, and the idea that we're coming alongside to try to support their work. We're not, and that goes beyond Habitat. That's actually Habitat then respecting the local leadership in the community and saying, how can we support your leadership, rather than the idea that we have the answer or we have the solution. And another axiom I've loved, I'm sorry, our power flickered, and I hope that's not going to be an issue. Another axiom I've used for years and years is we should be religious about our principles, but not our tactics. So how do you have a framing set of principles that should be inviolable, that you're not willing to compromise on, but have a huge amount of flexibility to contextualize the model based on what is truly most needed in a local context or local country? And that means that the way that we work in Nepal looks quite different than the way we work in Guatemala. And they're both Habitat, and the core principles are the same, but the actual programs are adapted to what's needed in their local context, the local government, the local laws, the local culture. But many of the principles can cross. And it's one of the joys for me, because I'm, in some ways, what doesn't change are the human interactions and relationships. But in other ways, it can look remarkably different country to country, and we're okay with that. But we still have to hold on to what's the frame, because at some point, for us, the frame is shelter. And we're not a food organization, though that's important. We're not a medical organization, though that's important. So you want to stay focused on what we are, but within that, try to view it's, when Habitat rolled out, it was you do it one way only, and there was a genius to the founder who then was able to spread that really far and really fast. But the trap of that was it was very cookie cutter in methodology and approach, and probably squelched some of the local initiative to be able to have that flexibility to adapt it to what was most needed in their communities. If that makes sense.
It does. And as just one brief follow-up on that. So, it's important for Habitat to work with local governments, national governments, other NGOs, is there, anything in your experience over the last 15 years that's really critical to that? Because many of our students are thinking about, do I want to go into a life of service? Do I want to go into, into an organization like that? But again, as you've said, the connectedness is so important. So there are lessons learned about how to effectively work with governmental entities and other NGOs.
Yeah, I think it's fundamental. And I believe that I make a couple observations. One, all the really complex things have to be multi-sector solutions. The nonprofit world, the private sector, or the government cannot do these things by themselves. So I think really complex issues have to have a multi-sector approach, and that requires partnership. I also believe, and nonprofits, and Habitat was part of the problem, have a tendency to say that they have the magic bullet. So if you're a housing organization, housing will solve everything. If you're a medical organization, health will solve everything. If you're a food or education, that will solve everything. The answer is no, right? A healthy community needs all of those and needs good jobs. And so now we would certainly argue housing is prerequisite. You pull any of one of those out and a community can't be fully healthy. So we made the commitment that we would try to, as the language we use, we want to be a partner and catalyst for worldwide access. So not only can we not do the housing by ourselves, but we also don't want to build unless the other elements of healthy community can be there as well. But we don't want to do those. We want to invite in partnerships. And one, I'll quit doing axioms, but my other axiom, which is hard earned, is that the only thing worse than partnering is not partnering. So partnering is hard and slow and messy and painful, but it's the only way you really can get to long-term solutions that work. And that really, as I mentioned before, has to start with partnering with the local community. And the vision has to be owned within the community itself. And then you have to array what are the series of forces around that. And I could tell some great stories, in US cities where mayors and police forces plus local community leaders plus charter schools plus Habitat plus jobs incubators plus healthy food came together and really radically changed a sub-community or community over a not that long period of years. But I really believe you need that holistic approach. And governments are tough. We work in some places where you don't want to work too closely with the government because there's not trust with their people if it's a particularly autocratic or tough place. At the same time, you want even bad governments to have good housing policy. So it is a tricky, we try to always offer our best thinking to any government in terms of what good housing policy would be, but we try to be careful about formal partnerships with governments that are oppressing their people or mistreating. So there's complexity in it. And I think the hard part is we want everything to be black and white and clean and clear. And community development is slow and messy and gray, and you've got to sort of stay in there because it's easy to just say, well, we're only going to work if everything's perfect, and there's not a lot of perfect out there.
Yeah, that's certainly the case, and I think it's compelling for for our listeners to really own that statement you made about the importance of the connectedness. And I think it's this sort of juxtaposition between recognizing you as an individual can really have an impact, but the way you have the kind of impact you want is being part of a community. So that's very, very powerful.
I do think this, one of the great challenges in our community, and we're having a conversation with them next week, is Robert Putnam's work, but we have become very individualistic in the United States, and that is not the way we historically were for much of certainly the post-war era, or even the 20s through if you got sort of the 30s through the 60s, we had a much more community-minded approach. Now there were gender issues and race issues and other pieces. And since then, the data would suggest we've moved to a much more individualistic space. And I think that's on a human level a bad thing, but it's also on a community level not getting the results we really want.
Mm-hmm. So let's shift back to you for a moment. We have a question that says, you mentioned to follow your heart and meet the needs of the world, paraphrasing what you said. So can you talk a little bit about how do you follow your heart? Describe the feeling and some of the conflicts that might bring about in your life.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to be aware there are tensions, right? So in our perfect world, I'm say this, but this is a little embarrassing. When I came back from India, I was on fire, and I turned down 2 really good business jobs because it's like, I have a deal with God, and I'm going to go work in a nonprofit that's going to help the poor. And suddenly all the doors closed. And if I'm really honest, which is not great in retrospect, my deal with God was, hey, God, I'll do anything you want as long as it meets my financial, geographic, ego gratification, power, and all my other sort of list of needs. And I had to then get through, a period where it was, basically what I heard back was, I'm not so interested in your job, I'm interested in your character, and let's focus on that for a while. And then I had to get to the point where, best I could, it was no strings, no conditions, which is a little scarier. And but I look back, and that was really important for me. So I don't think there are any easy answers, but some places to explore at least would be, there's a guy named Arthur Miller Jr., not the playwright, who was founded a search firm, and he had this idea of your motivated abilities, and that if you think back to your earliest memories, and not what you got blue ribbons for, but what really actually gave you a sense of satisfaction, that pattern ought to be consistent all through your life. And I think the noise part is that highly successful people can become performers. And if you're more successful, you get to be a better performer. And the real danger is you allow a gap between the public persona and what's really going on in your inner life. And that's where all the bad stuff starts showing up. And that's where and then you start covering stuff up because there's that gap. And so, when I think about, if you want to find purpose, and I've been talking about a spiritual lens, but if you take out spiritual and put in your values, so if you sort of take one piece, which is your values, one piece, which is your gifts, what are you actually good at, and get other people to give you feedback on that. That should be, some objectivity in that. And then what problem grabs you? And I think often it doesn't come right away. But try a bunch of stuff, and that volunteering can be really helpful because you can try more things in your jobs. You can try things, but think about, is there, most of the people who I know, who I think of as highly successful, didn't set out to be successful. They set out to solve something, or to fix something, or to change something. And then my godmother, who was my mentor, was an amazing woman. And she always had the thesis that if you chase power, you will fail, and if you chase, a social good or a significant problem, you'll accrue the power you need to address that problem. And it's not always easy. I think it's okay it's easier for me to say now because I'm old and I can look back and seeing all these, but it's actually okay to fail. And I had some wins along the way in my corporate career. I had a couple of spectacular failures, and that's okay too, because you learn more in the failures than you do in the successes. Because usually you don't always know why you succeeded, but it's pretty clear when things fail, at least you can learn something about that. So that's a fuzzy answer, but the exploration, I think, is really helpful. And getting people, I'm a huge fan of finding wise people who know you well, and then listening to them. And it's important that they're both wise and that they know you well, but to give you advice. But it is, but I'd circle back to that view that one, no job is perfect, and two, it's unlikely you'll find your perfect job right away. So that, there'll be sequential. My dad loved teaching. He was a beloved professor. And as he used to joke, maybe not joke, he would say, I would teach for free. They have to pay me to go to meetings. He hated the administrative side of the academic
I'm with that,
world.
by the way.
It's, but I think every job's like that, right? So no job is 100%, lollipops and happiness, but you want the ratio to be, more of your time getting to be spent on stuff that matters, that draws on your skills. And then you can, there's a paying your dues aspect of most early jobs that comes with the territory.
And again, you've emphasized two things, Jonathan, that we certainly try to embrace in our school, and what we teach at the Institute. One of which is, failure is an important teacher, and this notion of growth mindset it's an opportunity to evaluate and continuously improve. And again, this importance of building a network of people that you trust and who know you and can provide counsel and support in many ways. And I think sometimes it's hard for our students to invest in building a network, whether it's through just their discomfort of getting out of their comfort zone to reach out, or not knowing if there's the sort of value to those they're reaching out to. And I think that, we try to talk about how important it is to recognize that people do want to give back. And, particularly people like yourself that have succeeded, you're giving us your time this evening. You've learned a lot in the world that you're sharing with us. And I think sometimes we forget there are a lot of people out there, that are willing to, provide that kind of counsel and advice. And, the first step is to ask. And the worst thing that can happen is, you get a no. So I want to move on to, it's interesting. There's several really interesting, sort of threads here in the conversations. But one, I'd really like to, explore a little bit, which is this this notion of, it's people over profit, or kind of passion over enterprise. And we talk a lot about how that you need both, right? You need mission and you need margin, right? Even an organization as rock solid and amazing as Habitat for Humanity has to be sustainable. So can you talk a little bit about kind of your role and just how you think about this balance between mission and not technically margin, but economic sustainability for something like Habitat?
No, it's really important, and it's what your engine is, and I think if you don't acknowledge the tension, you're kidding yourself, right? So because the tensions are out there, and companies do balance scorecards, and then what happens is under duress, all the balance goes away, because if there's no money, then all the other good stuff doesn't happen either. And so it is, and I think I mentioned it earlier in my comments, but in some ways, in the storm is when your character gets revealed, right? You get, and then it shows if you're just kidding about your values and principles. And I so respect somebody I admire enormously that used to be on my board is Ed Bastian, the head of Delta. My gosh, I can't think of a company that's had a worse year in terms of their business being destroyed. And they have just lived their values. And he has taken personally, and the way that he has navigated it, I think is so impressive. And that gives me great faith that they will come back and come back strongly when we all survive this, because the people, he's got the belief of in his leadership within the company. And so if you're a nonprofit, you still have to get funded. And that's exactly right, which is will people trust you enough that they will invest in your mission? And we're kind of an odd hybrid. And I actually think increasingly the lines are blurring in ways to me that are exciting. So really your tax status is probably less critical a driver anymore, but ultimately it's your ability to keep functioning. So Habitat has our big, we have several billion in mortgage receivables. We actually run a chain of these Habitat for Humanity restores. I don't know if there is one in Davis or not, but it's a chain of home product thrift stores that recycle goods. And that's actually this year, it'll be about a $600 million business that contributed last year $145 million to kind of net reinvestable dollars to our local affiliates. And so that's a social enterprise. But we still raise a lot of philanthropy every year. And if we didn't have the philanthropy, we couldn't grow, we couldn't continue to invest. And it's so whether you're a for-profit, which means you need to make enough money to be able to pay your people well, to be able to grow, to be able to invest in reinvest in your business. You need the trust of your customers. You need the trust. I think some of the dynamics are very similar. And I don't think we should apologize for that. I'm not I'm actually wildly pro-business. What we need are principled, values-based business leaders who create jobs, because the reality is if everybody had a good paying job, then we wouldn't need so many of the nonprofits, because people could then acquire their own services, pay for their own thing. The dilemma now is the sort of cost of living mostly for housing and health is so high relative to incomes that people can't make the math work at a household level. And but if we look at the crisis right now, I think business is a huge part of the answer. And I'm very much a market friendly, but I also believe, and I think we studied back in business school, it tends to be oversimplified. I think for the people who say the only thing is short-term shareholder return I think that's an abusive view of business from a stewardship perspective. And I think when businesses take a long-term perspective, then they'll tend to invest in the communities, because they can't attract and retain the best talent if they don't have decent schools, if they don't have housing, if they don't have a healthy community in which to live and work in the places. So I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. but I don't think businesses should apologize for making a profit either. And it's a fine line of living in that tension appropriately. And I think leaders have to live in a whole basket of these tensions. So what's the balance of your family versus your job? What's the balance of making a lot of money versus making enough money? What's the mix? And those are very personal questions. And for those of you who are thinking about a very mission driven life or a life of service, you have to decide are you willing to put up with a low income lifestyle? And again, it's not a right or wrong, and I certainly don't judge. One thing that I do recommend is if you think you want to do a life of eventually do something that may not pay well or do something more mission oriented, is live a nonprofit lifestyle from the beginning and then save money to give yourself margin. So one thing that really helped is my wife and I agreed on that, and we lived way beneath our income while I was in the private sector, and that actually gave us the margin to be able for me to take an 80% pay cut to go work for the church, because we hadn't set up a lifestyle that we couldn't make work. And those golden handcuffs are really tough. And I know a lot of business people who say, "Oh, I really want to go do this," but they've sort of boxed themselves in to a very expensive lifestyle that they're not willing to give up.
Yeah, I too have seen that in more than once. So you serve, Jonathan, in Habitat for Humanity across the 70 countries that you work, and across the 50 states. I know you serve a very diverse population of people. Your volunteers, the communities that you're working in. Talk a little bit about the organization Habitat for Humanity and how you think about the importance of the diversity of your staff, and how they work with a diverse group of volunteers serving a very diverse group of people in communities across the world.
We've been spending so much time talking about this year, especially. It's always been a topic for us, but certainly in the last 6 months, it's been a huge topic, especially in the United States. Philosophically, the way Habitat rolled out was actually designed to be a movement, not an organization. So it was always locally owned, and I think there was a great strength to that. So the founder was kind of a Johnny Appleseed. If you sat on a plane with him, by the time you got off the plane, you'd go start Habitat wherever you lived, and so we got really wide and not at all deep, but it was an amazing kind of growth story based on a charismatic founder. I think where it's gotten harder then over time is it's another of these tensions. How do you professionalize and get more efficiency, but not lose that sense of local ownership and grassroots? And again, I think it's living in the appropriate balance of that. So we are federated, which means that we have just under 1,200 now, which used to be 1,800. So we've had a lot of mergers, which we've encouraged to try to get some more operational efficiency, but still very much locally owned. And those are almost like franchises in the US, where the local Habitat has a local board of directors. They raise their own funds. We license the name, we raise a lot of national money for them, and we hold them accountable to sort of the minimum set of fiduciary standards and requirements. And then we collectively work together on things like advocacy and policy at the local level, state level, especially federal and global level with the UN. So there is I like the idea of this twin citizenship. It tends to be sometimes like any organization, the field disrespects the center and vice versa, and we want to fight that idea. Some of our countries are actually subsidiaries that we manage directly, but our preferred model is that they are locally owned with a local national organization and board, but again, with legal agreements and grants and requirements. We do most of the funding for most of our low-income countries, though our middle-income countries and higher raise a lot of their own funding. So a place like India or Philippines or Indonesia, they have significant local fundraising in addition to the international fundraising. It's much tougher to get a lot of local fundraising in very low-income contexts, but it is. And I've learned a lot about governance, and so much of it is sort of listening and respect. And the hard part for us is we have so many entities that makes it really complex. It's hard to have a personal relationship with 1,200 boards of directors. And so now probably 500 of those represent 80 to 90% of the work we do, but even 500 boards of directors is impossible. And so it's a constant process of trying to communicate and find balance. And then the world changes. So we look like we're being mean, but mortgage lending standards changed fundamentally after the housing crisis, right? So what used to be good enough isn't good enough anymore. And that's not because Habitat's being tougher, it's because the laws change. And of course, Habitat as a mortgage lender has to live up to the law. So it's a constant process of working on leadership. To Joe's point, so we have regional offices the way we're set up. So we have an office in Manila that supports Asia and Pacific. And I think we have staff there from 22 different nationalities, and it's an amazing, but virtually all Asian staff. We have a team in Costa Rica that is pretty much all Latin American, that serves Latin America and the Caribbean. We have a team in Bratislava that serves Eastern Europe, and a team in Nairobi that serves mostly sub-Saharan Africa, with the Middle East support coming from both sides. And then our US team is based in Atlanta and our historic hometown of Americus, Georgia, and co-locates with the umbrella organization, HFHI. So we are in a big conversation in the US around race. Our numbers are pretty good, but that doesn't mean we're where we want to be. So we do pretty well in representation, but still not as well. And to Joe's point, if we were to look at true representation, which some international NGOs have done, we might move our headquarters to Asia, and because 98% of our work is outside the US, but we're unusual because we have a big US footprint also. And we're looking in the US hard at our affiliate leadership is still very white. And if you look at who we serve, it's everybody. But since we serve people that are at 30 to 60% of area median income, it is, I think the national population is 12 or 13% Black, and we serve about 40% Black. And then we serve a whole broad basket of immigrant families from all different geographies, large Hispanic and Asian components, and then white as well. So we try to serve anybody that meets our criteria. But one of the big conversations we're having right now is that housing is probably the most tangible and specific example of systemic racism in the United States. And most people don't know, but the federal government mandated segregated housing, both pre and post World War II. And then the FHA, which is where the word redlining came from, enforced that the attractive lending rates go to the better neighborhoods, which turned out to be the white neighborhoods, so that there was so many of us, my family included, benefited from a family that owned a home and built an intergenerational asset in that big boom in housing from the 50s up to the 70s, or the 40s up to the 70s. And so many Black families were left out of that. And so you get this asset gap, and then you get, because of the lending practices, it became harder, it became self-fulfilling. It was harder to get a loan, therefore harder to keep a loan. So we actually think we should intentionally be working on the home ownership gap. And white home ownership is about 70% in the United States. There's about a 30% gap, and the lowest is Black, and then Hispanic, and then Asian. And so we think we ought to, from a policy perspective, continue to serve everyone, but that there ought to be intentional efforts to counteract some of the intentional ones all over the country. I mean, it's really amazing. Up until the 1970s, communities, you'd find them all over California too, that even in the 70s, the deeds were restricted where houses could not be sold to a Black or a Jew in huge swaths of the United States. And it's, which is a horrible stain on our country.
As you think about Habitat going forward, and I know it's a hard question, Jonathan, and we really appreciate your willingness to really engage in this, but so how do we grapple with this broadly, right? We're called to creating a society where everyone's given an opportunity, and where we treat people with kindness and with respect, and provide a path forward to fulfillment and happiness. It's got to be a struggle for you to see some of the things you've seen. Can you talk a little bit about how do you keep kindness in your personal vision and mission and heart, and how do you help imbue the organization and the 1,200 boards of directors across the world with it?
I think the good news, I think one is always at least trying, empathy is so desperately needed, which is at least always trying to walk in the other person's shoes and think about, how would I feel if I were on the other side of the conversation? Because we tend to get indignant, we tend to get our feelings hurt because our intentions are good, even if our actions weren't always good. And I think there has to be a true willingness to learn and listen. And I've been in so many conversations and just doing my own homework, because I don't want to put the burden on all my Black friends to educate me. That's not fair. But it is, I had a narrative, I think in my head, because my grandmother and my mom were deeply involved in the civil rights movement. And when I was a little kid, it was so starkly wrong. I mean, the restaurants in North Carolina were segregated, and there were, the rules were just objectively unfair. Now it's much more subtle, and therefore it gets harder. And I think I had a narrative in my head that things are so much better because they are better, but that made me comfortable thinking they were good enough, and I think that I was wrong on that, and I've had to really think about how to do better. I think the kindness piece, I wish there was an easy answer because it always comes back as simplistic, but I do think we need to show people what good can look like. And I'll tell a mini story from the book that is one of my favorites because it's from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Story that's been in so many places around the United States, but this was a historically important African American community that had gone downhill decade after decade. So really well located, close to downtown in the city of Winston-Salem, but had really gone into disrepair, high crime, drugs. We talked to the families in this community, and they had two clear-cut goals. One, do something about the crime, and two, make it a place where young families would want to move in again versus anybody who could moving out. And the houses were really dilapidated, the housing stock was poor, and Habitat started with a core cluster of families in the community who had this vision. And then they started building a coalition. And Habitat made a first commitment. They would tear down and rebuild 16 houses right at the entrance to the community that sort of changed the face of the community to the outside. And because of that, some for-profit investors came in and bought up some other houses and fixed them up to make them into affordable rental. A small rental project got redone as green housing. The community committed to a new charter school run by the public schools. The city committed to hire a higher police presence in the community. And I came in there after 2 years into this project to dedicate those first 16 houses. And I remember this policeman, Billy, walking me around, and he was volunteering in the community. He said, if you've been here 2 years ago, I would have been here to protect you. And now this big sweep was on. He said, now look what we've done. And crime was down 70% already. And now Habitat's built 64 houses on the way to 120. They actually moved into the neighborhood. They started sharing all of the software in terms of the family training with everybody in the community. And anybody that wanted could take their classes. They had a tool lending for people that want to start fixing up their own houses. And it's really a beautiful picture. And the city manager told me, when I get depressed, I just drive back through Cherry Street to remember what's possible. And so there are glimmers of what good can look like. And I think the key is that we just need to have those, it's still going to be city by city, town by town. And I'm more optimistic about the city level. I think federal's really hard and really polarized and really rough. And we have to keep fighting there. It's really important. But I actually think mayors and cities have the best opportunity to actually make a significant difference in a reasonable period of time if they can do that coalition building. And I do think it circles back to the conversation where we started around class, because we've got to find ways to break down those barriers and create meaningful relationships. And I think, people, none of this original to me, people used to have more intermediary organizations. So in an earlier era, with all the imperfections, more people belong to a faith organization, more people belong to some kind of a service organization, a Rotary or Kiwanis or one of those local service organizations. More people, the towns were more mixed economically, so more people just went to school and interacted on a daily basis with more people. And even though there were terrible gender inequities with it, people used to marry outside their social class on a much more frequent basis. And now, we're part of the problem, right? Our kids tend to only know kids who are in their economic class, therefore they marry. Therefore, there's this sort of self-fulfilling aspect of it that makes it harder and harder for social mobility. But the data on social mobility is really compelling, and I'll stop preaching after this. But Raj Chetty, with his big project from Stanford and then Harvard and MIT, if you look at the data, it's so powerful that kids who grow up in mixed income communities still have reasonable social mobility, but kids that grow up in concentrated poverty have virtually zero. And so we know part of the answer has to be building mixed income communities, but that's where otherwise liberal, good-hearted people stop being nice, because they'll go to the barricades before they let those people kind of build anywhere near them. And so we do have to, we've got to change not in my backyard to yes in my backyard, and figure out a way to actually create mixed income communities for everybody's sake.
Thank you for that candid answer, Jonathan, and thank you so much for your time and your engagement this evening. On behalf of UC Davis, we're so grateful for your willingness to speak with us. So in a moment, I want to ask you for some closing remarks, but I do have one final question. As you think about your life's journey and the impact you've had, as your grandmother talked about, about being useful. What one piece of advice would you give to the earlier version of Jonathan back when you were a student at UNC or at the GSB or earlier career? What one piece of advice would you have wanted to hear, back when you were at that point in your life?
I'm not sure how well I would have heard it, but I would have, I think, wanted to hear that idea of character first. So who before what? And that if you're not clear on who you are and who you want to become, you can get trapped into all the career stuff. And the danger of that is you can ride a long way, and then without that strong foundation, suddenly it can all blow up if you haven't built the foundation. So I would have, and I was blessed with people who invested into me and at least created the frame of a good foundation, even if I had to grow into it. But I would encourage folks to spend the time to think deeply about what values frame are you going to use? What are the core kind of unshakable principles on which you want to build everything? And then think about the what and the how, but don't bypass the who.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. I love that, the who before the what. So after hearing Jonathan speak with us this evening, I suspect many of you are quite interested in his book. So if we could put up the slide that shares that for a moment. So Our Better Angels, it's a compelling read. I'm not just saying this because I adore Jonathan. I loved it, and I strongly encourage those that were engaged by our discussion this evening to check it out. And I also want to thank our sponsors for the Institute and for DEN, the Blackstone Foundation, and Techstars. This is the first of 3 talks this year in the Think, Do, and Discover series. And we've all been challenged by COVID-19. I suspect Jonathan's organization more than most. We've adapted our conferences to these speakers, and we're grateful to have folks like Jonathan to engage with us. If you'd like to learn more about the Davis Entrepreneurial Network, you can go to den.ucdavis.edu and learn anything you want to know about DEN, about the Institute, about the many organizations both on and off campus that are supporting innovation and entrepreneurship and being a change maker. So, Jonathan, I want to turn it back over to you for some final wrap-up remarks.
Great. Well, Joe, thank you so much. And I wish, the thing I hate about virtual is I can't see all of you, and I so look forward to and wish this were an in-person gathering where we could have the human connection we've been talking about. But I'm still at least glad that we have all learned to be better at virtual gathering. And it is, and I think if anything, my hope and prayer out of COVID is that people will value community at another level, because we've all had to give up so much community in this past year. And unfortunately have a ways to go, I fear, though I'm optimistic we will get better. The thing that I'm saddest about is I would love so much to be out in the communities personally, but I would also love for communities to be out. This is unique, where usually when there's a natural disaster, the surrounding areas can all go help. And this is very strange to have a global disaster where everyone is impacted and no one can go somewhere else to help. And so this is a tough one. But we've also seen in the midst of that amazing resilience. And the book, I hope, will just be an encouragement to folks. This is not a strategy book. It's not a business book. It's really a story of people just doing great things in their communities, and the unbelievable ripple effect of seeing that, where some of my favorite stories are, it starts with one person who just, whose heart gets changed, and then that starts to starts to move in really powerful ways. And so my hope is, that you'll read it and the response will be, I could go do something like that, and that you'll get out in the community and be a part of making it better, whether that's Habitat or whatever problem really grabs your heart and makes you want to go do something positive to change it. So I'm glad to be with you. I wish you all the best. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I just would share, if I can close, my favorite blessing, and this is from the Franciscan tradition, but may God bless you with discomfort at easy answers, half truths, and superficial relationships, so that you may live deep within your heart. May God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that you may wish for justice, freedom, and peace. And may God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in this world, so that you can do what others say cannot be done. And all God's people said, amen. Thank you. Great to be with you. And I hope we'll meet in person before long.
Thank you, Jonathan. And trust me, when all this is over, we will find a way to bring you to Davis. We would be so pleased to have you here. But in the interim, we are grateful for the time you took with us this evening, for all the work that you do, and you and your colleagues around the world with Habitat for Humanity International. So everyone, thank you very much for your attention this evening. We look forward to seeing you during the winter quarter for our next talk. And then again, I'm going to echo what Jonathan said, stay safe and healthy. Cheers, everybody. Bye.